and on YouTube.
Oh, YouTube, okay.
Yeah.
It's a constant battle to see. I mean, 1 week they work, 1 week they don't.
Well, it's also like which format people feel more comfortable with. Like,
Yeah.
it's kind of different. All right. So I just got the thumbs up that we are live. Welcome. This is Between Two Services, one of the digital ministries here at St. John's. I'm Father Dana Lockhart, and this morning I'm joined by someone who may be a new face to some of you. Joellen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Joellen Hayden, and I am new here. I'm a friend of Georgia Lockridge's, and Georgia invited me to come sometime last summer, and it took me until the fall. I'm sorry to get here, but I'm very glad that I am here. I drive over from Lexington, and so here I am appearing in the time of COVID.
Fantastic. And we're glad you're here. I think that there's a couple of things that I particularly want to hit in our conversation this morning. One is we have had people join us in the time of COVID. We've had new people who have come in and have watched us online and have started to show up and visiting. We've had new people who've been invited into the parish. And so as kind of our really big regathering, you may notice new faces at St. John's. And we give thanks to God for that even in this time of disruption, we are also still welcoming people into our community. And I thought we'd start with that. What was it like joining St. John's in the middle of this kind of odd pandemic time?
Well, first of all, I have to say I don't feel that I have actually really joined yet because I can't recognize people just above their masks, and
yeah,
it's very hard to, especially at the beginning when I first started coming, which was, I don't know, maybe November or something. People didn't stay for even a minute and a half after the service was over. It was, you did the service and you were gone, and so you're just coming into a group of faces that aren't even, that are sort of half faces, and
right.
So it's hard to join. I don't feel that I've joined yet. I'm here, but I'm not joined.
That's an important perspective for us to have, because I think that was something that I was noticing as we headed through the fall and into the winter. We would see new people, and some of them were people who had connections with people who were already members here, and some were people who had moved in and were looking at churches. But it was sort of like I would see new people, and then we were failing to make that connection. And I think, in a way, it's sort of like, how do you make that connection? Like, if you didn't already have Georgia here in the parish, it'd be very hard for us. Because as you said, you're walking in, you're trying to learn everyone's names, and everyone's faces are covered, and no one's staying after the service. Those traditional ways in which, like, even to just sort of shake hands with someone after service and be like, hi, this, like you and Tom this morning after the 8 o'clock service had that conversation, and you were masked, but it was still somewhat closer to a traditional church lobby conversation. Hi, this is who I am. Hi, welcome. This is my connection to the parish, etc. And so, what's your advice for us going forward? What do we need to do as we balance COVID and protocols while also wanting to be a place where people feel welcome and at home? Do you have any suggestions, advice, insight on that area?
Nothing
A
like
big
being
question.
put on the spot.
Not right.
That's okay.
Big question.
Yeah, right. Big question.
Solve the problem for us.
Well, now, so I have thought about that a lot. What would I do? What would I hope any parish would do, or whatever? I do have a scientific background. I understand, perhaps better than some people, about the viral capacity of infectious disease and various kinds of infectious disease and how they're transmitted, and the fact that an airborne virus is virtually impossible to control in the long run. and you just can't do it really. Um, and this is something new. I'm also a historian. This is something new to our culture. We haven't seen this for 100 years. And our mores in our culture 100 years ago in the 1920s were different than now. Now, this was going to become the Roaring '20s, so maybe there was some little bit breaking out that was kind of like now, but it wasn't still the same. So I don't think that we can remain masked as a group forever.
No.
I don't think anybody thinks that really. But the question is, how do we know? How do we know when it's okay not to have a mask on? Well, I think liturgically, from a standpoint of spiritual knowledge, we will never know. We never know these things. So it has to be some decision. And for me, I've come to the decision that I will mask to protect myself. That is my responsibility, and it's something I can control. I can control what kind of mask I wear, how tight it is, whether it, if I take my mask off and there's lines all over my face where it was tight enough. Mm-hmm. Nothing got through. I wear a KN95 mask. I wear it tightly, and frankly, I wear it to protect myself, because when I look around at the other mask-wearing people, at least half to three-quarters aren't wearing their mask tight enough to protect anybody, themselves or anybody else, and they're not a very good mask from a filtration standpoint. So I just finally decided I can't control what everybody else does. I wanted to stop being annoyed at people who weren't wearing their mask right.
Right.
Of which there's many. And so I decided that I would take personal responsibility for my health. I've had COVID. I got it after I was fully vaccinated, but before the boosters came out. I got it from my 83-year-old neighbor. 4 of us ended up finally having it, all fully vaccinated people, but not yet boosted because they weren't out yet. So I kind of know, I have a little more knowledge than some people about what we're fighting against here. But I think to return to some kind of normal community, we have to have our masks off, and those who wish to wear them or feel that they must wear them or have a medical condition to wear them are free to wear them. We wouldn't have any stigma about that.
Right.
We would never probably have had a stigma about that, except it wouldn't have been very common. In Japan, for instance, people wear masks all the time, and they've been doing it for decades.
Right.
So nobody says, well, why do you have your mask on today? I think that's how we would be here.
Right. Well, and I think that's something that maybe that's part of our post-COVID future, is that it will normalize mask wearing.
I think so.
For
very
occasional
much.
illnesses.
Yeah.
I've thought about, it's one of those things when you think about masks and liturgy. I've thought for a long time. I'm horribly allergic to lilies, and that's actually pretty common in the clergy. And so I've always asked, for the flower guild to cut the stamens out, but there's always like one that's missed. And I remember the first year I was at St. John's, we had determined that we were using Eucharistic prayer D, which is just it's very long and very beautiful and very ornate. And I can just remember like coughing and hacking and almost dying my way through it. And it is a bit of self-consciousness, because you're like, oh, well, here's all the wine that everyone's about to drink. Here's the bread everyone's about to eat. And here's the priest trying not to die with allergies and coughing and all of that. And I've thought, well, you know what, from now on, I'm just going to make sure during allergy season, I'm just wearing a mask at the Eucharist, right? Because for nothing else, I've found that it helps with those occasional seasonal allergies. The question of like when to go from not wearing masks to wearing masks, to me, most people don't have a very strong scientific background, and it's been really seems to me that it's actually a decision that's predicated more on emotion. It's more psychological necessarily than logical. I'm fascinated, for instance, by our 8 o'clock service, which has been technically mask optional for several weeks now, and yet everyone in the service was masked this morning. So, and last week and the week before that, so that even when we're masked optional, there's still a lot of mask wearing, and that continues to be the norm. And one of the things that we've gone back and forth with is when do we say that our main service is mask optional? And I've postponed that after talking with everyone into the summer, not because I want people to be wearing masks forever, but because really it comes down to how many people stop coming when masks are no longer the norm, right? Like if half the people in the congregation take their masks off at our main service, we would lose a good chunk of our attendance, and maybe other people would come. I don't know, but it's a very delicate balancing act, because for 2 years people were told masks protect you, masks keep you safe, and so yeah, this is a conundrum.
Well, it's really interesting to me that you say half the people at that service would not come anymore, because it's hard
Well, not
to
half,
imagine.
but like a good. I think we'd lose 20%. If half the people were to stop wearing masks at that service. I think that there's like this tipping point where it's like, well, if 1 or 2 people aren't wearing masks, then okay, we're fine, because 95% of the people here are. But then once masks come off, people start getting more anxious, and then they stop coming. I mean, it's an interesting conundrum anyways, that's kind of it's kind of the perception I've gotten of our community.
And yet, for me, who isn't really yet a part of the community in any deep way, probably if the masks don't come off relatively soon, like the summer, I'll give up.
Yeah.
I feel like I can't really become a part of this group, because not just the masks, but just because of the sense of distancing and wanting to be back to some new normal.
Right.
Which, I mean, our normal has always included infectious disease.
Right.
We've always known that the flu is a dangerous disease for some people, and that if you masked, you could have prevented a lot of flu infections. If you didn't come to church, you could certainly not get exposed. But it didn't see very many people who weren't doing that.
Right.
Who were doing that. So now it just seems as if all of a sudden we've defaulted to some new idea about infection, that this mask thing is really important. And it's not based on science, really, unless you, as I said, unless you take responsibility for your own mask, the kind it is, how tight you wear it, etc.
Right.
Then you can allay your own concerns. And by the way, protect others should you happen to be infected yourself. Remember, you have to be infected yourself before you can give it to anybody. So it's just, it's gotten into this realm of myth and fantasy and fear.
Right.
So.
Well, and I think about it because, so my background before I went to seminary was I was a foreign language educator, and there's this concept with language acquisition where, if you're learning a new language and you start making a repeated mistake early on in your language acquisition, that mistake then becomes fossilized, that error or that quirk becomes fossilized, and it becomes very hard to root that out later, which is one of the reasons why sometimes I think people in foreign language classrooms feel like their teachers are being very picky, like good teachers in, foreign language 101, 102, 201, 202. Those first four classes, good teachers are picky, because if you start making an error on a repeated basis, that becomes sort of cemented in your understanding of the language. And I've thought about COVID in terms of sort of like what was fossilized in our minds in the early days of the pandemic. I mean, and one of the things is it took forever for the CDC and the World Health Organization to acknowledge that the disease was spread by aerosols, which in my mind, so much of what we did early on, the social distancing, the the hand washing, taking all the hymnals out of the pews, this. I mean, like, there were just so many things where it was like surfaces had to be cleaned. Well, surfaces should always be clean, and restrooms should always be clean. And, like, you should wash your hands. These are all great things in general, but the obsessiveness of it, while ignoring the fact that really and it was weird because there were epidemiologists very early on who said this is an airborne virus and these are the measures you're going to have to take to control it. But that wasn't what was determining public policy, and it wasn't what was determining the guidelines that the church was given. And I think with distancing, that's one of the things that, to me, I have a lot of, I feel like that's become fossilized, this idea that if we're 6 feet apart, which was an obsessive, almost absurd. Like, I can remember in the early, when we were trying to reopen the church and the rules we had to follow, like walking around with a tape measure to just make sure we had 360 degrees of clearance, because that's what we were told to do to keep people safe. When in reality, what we know now, we would have been way better served focusing on better masks and ventilation, and then actually, this whole idea that there's this magic, as long as I'm more than 6 feet away from you, I'm somehow protected.
Yeah.
Which, well, who knows? I mean, if the air, like, if you're 8 feet away from me, but there's a fan behind you blowing all your respiratory droplets towards me, like, forget it.
Yeah. One thing I think would be interesting to talk about is how has the church in the past, the historian is coming out, how has the church in the past dealt with myth and fear, that's just coming on from one place or another,
right?
And how does the church combat those wrong ideas that people are fearful of and that drives their behavior?
Right. It's a really great question, and I think that if we cling tightly, I'm a very liturgical person. I see great value in it, and to me, it's sort of like, if our practices as the church were endangering and killing people, we wouldn't have survived this long, right?
That's right.
I mean, so there isn't always a pandemic, but there are always sort of endemic viruses that are out there. And so I'm a little skeptical when all of a sudden it's sort of like, let's rewrite everything that we're doing in order to ensure safety. But at the same time, that's more or less what we were commanded to do during this pandemic. So my answer to that question, I don't know what your answer to that question. My answer would be, I want us to get back to our sense of practice and identity and rootedness in the liturgy as gracefully and as pastorally as possible. Because I really do think that that there's value to that. There's value in tradition. Not that tradition never changes, or we never, we've always done it that way is going to be the last words said by the church. But at the same time, as we've watched, totally new and innovative practices have been terribly disruptive. And when we weigh the scales between how much safety versus how much disruption are we getting, I think it's fair to say, it's fair to have that argument. It's fair to have that conversation now, especially after everything that's happened in the last 2 years. How much safety did we gain from the amount of disruption we experienced?
Well, I can say that for me, church is I hope to be the major place that I find community. It's what I seek in church is community, and I can't build community in the way that the church is constrained right now because of the masking, distancing, not eating together, not sitting together and laughing together in small groups. That's how you build community. And it's prohibited or deeply constrained by the mask wearing, and I don't know if we even are supposed to do the distancing anymore. I mean, it's
I've given up on it.
Yeah.
I think it's yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I would say, is that it inhibits the community building and trying to join a community under these circumstances is pretty much impossible. I mean, my community at this point consists of people I already knew,
Right.
not people that I'm newly meeting. And so if I try to be new in a church or new in any other group, it's going to be, it has to go back to what served humanity well for millions of years, which was going without face coverings.
Right.
And that's where I am with it.
Which isn't to say, yeah. But then that's an interesting paradox, because if masks were optional here at St. John's, would you still come and wear your N95?
No, I would be maskless at this point.
Okay, at this point.
I would be maskless, but I will tell you, I'm leaving for Italy in about a month, and I'm going to go into a personal lockdown for 2 weeks ahead of time because I do not want to test positive for
Right.
COVID or anything before I get on that plane. So that's a great example of how I'm going to change my behavior for 2 weeks. I'm not going to certain things that I otherwise might go to, my transient reunion, for instance. I will come to church, but I'll be tightly masked. And so
Because you don't. I mean, because if you test positive in that window,
I can't go.
you can't go.
So there's an example of, yes, I would take my mask off in church today if I could.
I think one of the fears that I have about COVID, and that's really guided my thinking and leadership, is, I got COVID from my mom, in my family, before there were vaccines. And it was devastating. I mean, it was physically devastating. By the time I got to a long COVID clinic for an actual diagnosis, they were doing assessments, and, there's heart issues, neurological issues, fatigue. I remember when I started the rehabilitation program at court for long COVID, they did a 6-minute walk test. And, here I was before COVID, I was overweight, but I was very physically active. And all of a sudden, you just think, okay, well, walk across this room back and forth for 6 minutes. And you think, oh, it's nothing. I mean, I go hiking and I do these things. And then all of a sudden, I had tears in my eyes, because just going back and forth for 6 minutes, I had to sit down afterwards. I think the physical and ongoing devastation of long COVID, and that's the one piece where when we start talking about masks and lifting restrictions, that I really have to pray about, having experienced this personally and having watched other people go through it. I mean, younger people than I, healthier people than I, and then all kinds of people who had pre-existing conditions, who some are out of work. I mean, I'm very lucky that I have had a job that I've been able to work and serve throughout the pandemic. But I know people who, they're going on disability or long-term unemployment, and that's the one piece when we start talking about the virus, is that for a lot of people, they get it and it's miserable, but then it's over. But for a sizable portion of the population, particularly those who got it pre-vaccination or those who get it without vaccination, why anyone's still unvaccinated, I don't know, but we know that they're out there. We know, okay. But if you get it pre-vaccination or unvaccinated, I mean, then it can be debilitating.
Yeah, your chance of long COVID is far greater in
Yeah.
those cases. That's true. I do think that everyone will get COVID eventually. It is a very, very contagious respiratory virus. Everybody's going to get this. Everybody's had the common cold. Everybody's had the flu. They don't get it every year, but everybody eventually will get COVID. So the variants that are out there right now, frankly, if you're going to get it at all, just get Omicron and get it over with. It's much less severe than some of the ones in the past. So I guess that's another reason why I think we're going through all this, but inevitably, I believe, everyone will get the disease eventually. So
do you think that there was, so then there's another question that runs through my mind. Do you think, so like the original SARS virus, they were able to contain and control, and it didn't become a global pandemic. There have been other viruses and outbreaks that were able to get control. Do you think that if they're, I mean, this is also a question I have right now, is if we could go back in time and take the right measures at the right time, like at what point in this did you conclude, okay, genie's out of the bottle, this thing is spreading in the community, everyone's going to get it? Because I think at least for the first year, I thought that might not be the case. I thought that we might get to a point where we could get it to go under control enough that through vaccination and through other means, a lot of people wouldn't get it.
well, I have to, when I saw that lots of people weren't getting vaccinated, if there was ever a time when I thought the genie could put back in the bottle, that was when that thought ended.
Yeah.
When we just didn't have any rush to be vaccinated, and I just thought, we're done. So I would say that was pretty early in the vaccination process, March maybe of last year, maybe. Or was that when I can't even remember. See, at this point, was it 2 years ago or 1 year ago that we all got vaccinated? I don't even know. I think it was a year ago.
Well,
So that's when I said, and really even before that, there were so many people who weren't compliant with the mask, who didn't wear their masks right, or were wearing completely ineffective masks. I really didn't. Early
Right.
on, I gave up on this.
or who invented new federal laws that don't really exist to exempt them from mask wearing. It's all kind of fascinating. So obviously, as we kind of work through this, we can expect more outbreaks to occur. We know that eventually the masks are going to have to come off, just for the well-being of everybody, that people might have different comfort levels with that. And so we may see people wearing masks, that might be a norm in the future, but I think the kind of mandatory mask wearing is going to go away. What would you encourage us as a congregation to do in the next 3 months to kind of help make us the kind of welcoming place that this place, because I can assure you, this place was really welcoming before COVID. How do we reclaim that kind of energy and welcome someone like you into our midst?
I would say, and I don't know what it was that people did to become welcoming, that made them welcoming people back then. We have to do exactly that now.
Yeah.
And if the mask is what keeps us from doing it, we need to identify very specifically, we can't do it and it's because of masking. So it'll help to flesh out and make more specific what is the downside of keeping the masks on versus a kind of a vague going forward that I feel we're, not just this parish, but the rest of the Episcopal Church is in at this point. I'm associated with a couple of other parishes not here, and they're all in the same sort of place.
Right.
Whereas all the Presbyterians I know are maskless, all the Baptists are maskless. I think the Methodists are maskless at this point. So somehow or another, they're making it work, and what's going on here?
Right. Of course, for better or for worse, our system, as I like to say, there were a lot of things when it pertains to the Episcopal Church. It's the church with bishops, right?
Mm-hmm.
And other churches have bishops, but they don't have capital B bishops, in the sense that the directives that we were given, now a lot of those are fading away. And Bishop Mark's been very good to lift restrictions and to allow more local autonomy. I think part of our struggle coming out of this is that we were probably bound up tighter than most other denominations. I think other than the AME church, which for particular reasons about how the virus hit the African American community were even more restrictive than we are. But I think when it comes to Versailles, other than the AMEs, we probably had the most restrictions on us in terms of the local churches. I mean, even the Catholic Church, their bishop was initially, very restrictive, but then gradually they got back to normal a little faster than we were able to.
Well, I do think the longer we keep the masks on, the worse the harder it's going to be to give them up. And the more people are going to use them and defend them and just without any, they can't put their finger on it, but they're just not comfortable unless people are masked. And that the longer we let it go on, the longer that will linger. And to get back to your question, though, about welcoming, whatever people did to welcome people and to enfold them in the community. George has already put me on a committee for the 175th anniversary.
Yay.
So that's a great way to get involved. And I would certainly hope that by our 175th anniversary celebrations that we've taken our masks off, those of us who wish to. Now, that doesn't mean everybody has to, but
Yeah.
so Zan outside the door.
She is.
Watch.
Yeah, like as always, Joellen before was like, how long does this go? And I said, usually until Ann stands outside the door and says, wrap it up. So that's happening now. So I want to wish everyone a good morning. Thank you, Joellen, for coming on. If you see Joellen, please introduce yourself, masked or not. And this is my plug. I think getting back to brunch is important. I think fellowship is important. I think reactivating ECW, Men's Club, our other groups is important. So let's get back on. Let's get back open. Thank you.